So here in chapter one, this is kind of designed for people that have not had an economics course before, or maybe haven't had one for a while. So you might find this chapter to be pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but again, it sets a solid foundation for all of us in the course. So if anything, just kind of treat it as, the simple things we do in the beginning, getting to know you kind of stage, for things being maybe a little bit easier. Now, um, I've made these slides largely myself. What I've done is I've just kind of, after reading the chapter and whatnot, I've just tried to kind of summarize what's all going on in the chapter. So, there are possibilities of things being mistakes. The point of these physical slides is since I have made them myself, what it does is it gives you a visual image of something to look at while I'm talking. And it gives me kind of the prompts of like how to structure what I'm talking about. Um, so with that said, let's go back to like when you started to learn economics all the way back, let's say, for instance, in Econ 201 or 202, and that would be when you took principles of micro or macro. What you would have done in that first week is you would have talked about first what is economics, right? And that economics, as I kind of simply put it when I teach the course, is that economics is um, at least for the neoclassical economists, that economics is a science of scarcity, and that as a um, science of scarcity, sorry, I just need to get the pen working here. I'm going to add this into quotes here because what the neoclassical economists, the mainstream economists, want us to kind of think is that their approach is, again, as it's being scientific, that would mean that we have a largely mathematical based approach to understanding how scarcity is dealt with. And what is scarcity? Scarcity is this idea that we have unlimited wants and needs, but limited resources and how to satisfy those wants and needs. And that when we think about so we have unlimited wants and needs, but limited resources to satisfy those, right? So how are you going to pick which wants and needs you're going to satisfy with the resources that you have that are available? Well, what we do is we talk about consumers having a goal and we talk about firms having a goal. What do firms want to do? They want to maximize their profit, right? They want to maximize that difference between total revenue and total cost. For consumers, they're maximizing something different. That thing that's different that they're maximizing is what you would remember as utility or some notion of consumers trying to be satisfied or as happy as they possibly can be. And so what that leads to are these kinds of key questions then in economics. How are we going to decide these scarcity decisions, right? What resources are we going to use to satisfy what needs, but also whose needs, right? What ends should get the priority, right? What wants and needs are going to get the priority. But I'm going to add also whose needs are going to be satisfied. In the market-based system that we've largely created for ourselves in the world today, whose needs get met? Those who can afford things. What needs get met? Whatever it is the people want that are paying for it, right? So if we as a society say we want to focus on producing, um, a certain kind of food item. Well, that decision might not be good for the environment or might not even be something healthy for us. But because we've decided to produce that thing and a lot of it, that is what we get. Why do I say that? Well, I mean, one example would be is that the American diet is very different than, for instance, a Middle Eastern diet or even a Western European diet. The American diet has lots of saturated fats, lots of corn syrup, lots of other bad things. But what that means is that because of the way that our diet exists, right, which is largely determined by the fact that, right, we as consumers want our food as cheap as possible, and that means it needs to be preserved for a long time. It needs to taste in a certain way, right, and it's going to have certain food dyes and whatnot. That means that then the things that we produce are oriented around that Western American style diet, right? And uh, that means that others' needs are being neglected, those who can't pay for it, um, or maybe even those who don't have those same needs. In economics, at least mainstream economics, we don't make a lot of value judgments here at this point. By that I mean, um, we don't get too involved, or we only get reluctantly involved when it comes to banning the consumption of certain goods, right? Cigarettes, right? Marijuana, right? Alcohol. Three goods that I've just described to you where, for instance, for tobacco, right? Whereas anyone could buy it, and then starting in the 1960s, we started to place controls, and then it strengthened even further of like where you could smoke and whatnot. Alcohol, right? We had a time of prohibition in the United States where alcohol wasn't allowed at all. Then the drinking age was like 18 up until the 1980s, and then it became 21, right? And that's the number we're at today. Cigarettes, by the way, it's 18 in most states, but even here in the state of Hawaii, you have to be 21 to be able to smoke. Um, and then marijuana, right? Some states it's allowed only for medicinal purposes. Some states it's allowed for personal reasons. Some states it's not allowed at all. Right? And we debate these things about, it's a uh, in terms of what economists think, economists don't really get involved in this kind of thing for the most part. Um, it's more of a value judgment, right? Um, and that's not really a place where economists really feel any authority or where they're going to intervene very much. Now, what's different here about ecological economics is that we are going to be infusing here a value system. In some sense, mainstream economics that we'll look at it here in the next slide is value free. Value free in the sense that we aren't going to have any overriding principles that dictate how we do things here. And so that's what we start to see here. In the neoclassical economic theory that you've learned primarily up to this point, is that we focus on markets and how markets make these decisions of that markets decide whose needs are met. So for the most part, what we'd say is that the market decides whose needs are going to be met and what resources we're going to use to satisfy them. And then we get to the second bullet point here is that we then presume again that the firm is trying to maximize its profit, the consumer is trying to maximize their utility, but there's no limits. How happy is too happy? Dude, there is no such thing as too happy. How much profit is too profit? Dude, ask Elon Musk, ask the Amazon guy, what's his name? Jeff Bezos, right? And what would they tell you, right? There is no such thing as too much profit. Ask any human, how much is too happy? No such thing. And so the problem that creates is that because these goals are insatiable, meaning there is no such thing as enough, then you need to grow the economy a lot, constantly, to be able to meet these insatiable needs. And so what we do, typically in chapter 2 of a course, is that we create what's called the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF, where we could talk about two different goods, let's say, that I could make good X and good Y, and that we then try to plot using the resources that exist to draw this line. Where are we? If we're here, we're not using all of our resources efficiently. The goal is to operate on this curved line, which represents maximum production given the resources that we have. You can't operate outside of the frontier because you don't have enough resources to be there. But then the goal when you take a principles of economics course, as that chapter kind of ends, and again, it's generally chapter 2 in a course. Generally, generally the way that we look at this is that we try to think of ways we can structure the economy to get us close to that frontier, the F in production possibilities frontier. We try to get as close to that frontier as possible. And then what we do is we figure out why is it, if an economy is below the frontier, what is it that we can do to get us closer to the frontier? Along that frontier, there are trade-offs. So the only way when you're on this line, this frontier, the only way you can get more of good X is by giving up Y, having less of it. Or vice versa. The only way I can get more Y is by giving up X, if I'm along the frontier. When I'm below the frontier, I am inefficient, as opposed to Pareto efficient. And what I can see here is that if I'm below the frontier, I can get more Y without giving up X. Or I can get more X without giving up Y. Or I can have more of both. That's what makes that inefficient, is that trade-off doesn't exist. That does exist along the frontier. And so when you took principles of microeconomics or even of macroeconomics, that was our focus. We wrapped up the chapter 2, and then you did supply and demand, and then right in supply and demand would be kind of highlighting this market mechanism. And then typically, especially if you took the course with me, that's when we have the first exam. Where we now deviate from this in ecological economics is, what is the alternative to that understanding that I just gave you here? That the alternative is that we don't just look at the goal being on this frontier, being Pareto efficient. It's important still. It's still important to be efficient because you don't want to waste resources. But you're going to care about other things as well. And those other things that you're going to care about as well are things that we don't talk about generally in an economics course. Let's start with the second one first. Fair distribution of resources. What is fair? Well, that would generally involve some kind of principle or some value judgment that doesn't exist in mainstream economics. right? I talked in the earlier thing about that Small is Beautiful book, the idea of Buddhist economics. Well, that would be your your value principle, right? So then what we would use is Buddhist principles to differentiate fair from unfair, and then decide how to distribute resources according to that principle. But then we would also look at something like ecological health, right? So now we're balancing things. In ecological economics, we're balancing efficiency with ecological health, with fair distribution of resources according to some principle. And also, this third bullet point actually comes directly from another pretty important um, early ecological economist who described the Earth as a ship with a limited carrying capacity. Um, uh, and the guy is a little bit out there, but anyway, the metaphor that's created here, I think, though, is pretty telling. Which is, I mean, we should all be generally aware that we have limited resources on this planet, and with those limited resources, we can only do as much as we can with the resources that we have. So, this is a general scarcity issue. We need to have some principle, some value that decides how we meet this scarcity problem. And so again, something like Buddhist economics or just a very general notion of ecological health could dictate how we do things. But it's not just efficiency, which again differentiating this from environmental economics. In environmental economics, it is everything from here to the end is deleted. It would just say environmental economics recognizes the importance of efficient allocation, because environmental economics is all about removing inefficiencies, primarily externalities. And so one of the things that then, as we kind of transition here from, let's say, a microeconomics discussion to a macroeconomics discussion, one of the other things that we talk about when we get to macroeconomics is we talk about the importance of growth. Growth meaning, in our traditional macroeconomics course, we just talk about the economy getting bigger, which here, if I use that same PPF discussion, would just mean that my economy has become bigger. How does it become bigger? Well, either we have more resources, we have more people, we have better technology, something that's happening that's helping the economy grow. And as we said back on slide 2, the economy is continually trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's the only goal. That's the focus of mainstream economics, or what we would just call neoclassical NCL economics. That's different than this. In ecological economics, besides expanding our focus to things other than efficiency, in ecological economics, we talk about development. And we talk about things that are produced being fundamentally different. That they're designed in a way, for instance, to improve, human well-being, as corny and cheesy as that sounds. The best way we could talk about development is that it's not as clear, it's not as transparent. how things are qualitatively becoming better. We would just know that it is. Um, there's oftentimes this fear: is AI, you know, is it aiding in the growth of the economy, or is it aiding in the development of the economy? Right. And so people that would say it doesn't aid in the development of the economy might talk about all the pitfalls of AI, right? That it, stops people from being able to write well because AI just generates things, or that it stops people from learning how to do research because AI will do the research, um, right? Or that AI might eliminate, identity creating jobs that are so mundane that people just don't do them anymore, like data entry or whatnot, or some simple coding, which AI could do. It might help an economy grow because now I can do things even more efficiently, right? If I can have a computer create spreadsheets for me rather than a person, that's going to help an economy grow. But the loss of that kind of job means that we're not going to have that development in the same way that we used to have it. Ecological economics is generally going to be calling for an end to our focus on growth, and rather that we reorient ourselves to thinking about making things that improve our lives. And that's in ecological economics. What you'll see is that we talk a bit more about what would be called co-evolutionary economics. And in co-evolutionary economics, again, we're looking at these values. We're looking at the way that the economic system is part of the human culture and the institutions and the way that these things change over time. So a lot of this is going to come also from, um, as well, institutional economics. And for those of you who've taken history of economic thought with me, that would be individuals like Veblen and whatnot. But we just look at how the way that we create markets, that markets are institutionally and culturally determined. And that as the society changes, for instance, from a hunter-gatherer to an agricultural society, then to the Industrial Revolution, to whatever this current system that we're existing in, as these things change, we would expect the economy to change as well. And that human culture changes in part because of technological advances, because of the population growing, because of certain resources changing. You could even say the political scene changing, um, priorities changing. Um, I would even extend it further if we looked at things like religion. If we looked at, right, that we go through times where society seems incredibly religiously oriented, right? If we look at the 19th century, we often see that people are very close to their faith. And then, right, we could look at the 20th century where people then start to fall out of their faith and then it becomes revived again and then it goes away, right? And it kind of goes in these ebbs and flows. And all of this is part of what those who are studying co-evolutionary economics would all look at. How does the economic system emerge out of that larger discussion? Okay. Um, when we look at these constraints and we want to look at what ecological constraints are imposed on society, what we see is that when the Industrial Revolution happened in the late 1700s, we saw that consumer goods became more prevalent, but that the natural resources used to produce them became in shorter supply. So we had increased scarcity of natural resources, and we had fewer um, shortfalls, deficiencies in the consumer goods. So everyone felt a little bit more satisfied, but we had less natural resources. So then what we had to do throughout the 1800s and 1900s is we had to redesign our economic system to reflect this more consumer-driven economy, to reflect this scarcity of natural resources economy. And we see that it's especially accelerated after World War II, when the modern industrial society, consumer-driven economy really comes into play. And in that case, what you're seeing there is that, you know, uh, consumers and workers all become oriented around growing the economy, trying not to waste resources as much, but doing it all with the idea that, to waste a natural resource means that you get less production of those other goods. But now what it does is it also then makes it more important that we do have that discussion of ecological economics, because we again want to have that value system for how we address shortfalls in natural resources and whose needs we're going to be trying to meet. The other thing that we need, we've already talked about this idea that in ecological economics, that there needs to be that focus on using value, let's just call it value judgments. So if we use value judgments to determine who gets the goods, that would be all what's done in ecological economics. But what ecological economics would also do is they do focus on something that mainstream economists don't focus on, which would be scale. And it really comes down to this kind of statement, which is kind of what comes out in that book that I said was the one that I loved the most in my undergraduate career, That Small is Beautiful. I mean, I remember reading it. Like, it sounds very corny when I say it this way, but I remember it was 1997, March 1997, and what is early April 2025. But I remember it was March 2020, March 1997, and I'm in France, and I picked up the book, Small is Beautiful, and I mean, it was just a page turner. I just loved the book, and it really shifted for me dramatically, how we understand, how I understood the way that uh, things about how things are organized the way that they are. And as a mainstream economist, we don't say this question, how big is big enough? We don't talk about things in that way. An ecological economist would, right? What is the optimal size for the economy to be able to meet the needs that we have and address these different distribution issues? And so, as we focus on things like fairness, that's going to be part of the discussion for an ecological economist. And so that's what takes us to then this last concluding slide here. Economics just as a field in general, from even when you took 201 or 202, is that what we know, what may have attracted some of you to economics as a field, was that it did help us understand what we wanted, and this idea that there were trade-offs, there were opportunity costs to doing some things, and that to get more of one thing, you had to sacrifice something of the other. Ecological economics differs from that in the sense that it looks about whether this relentless pursuit of economic growth is worth the sacrifices for the environment and just our own personal human well-being that it seems to depend on. right? And so that would go from everything from, we could look at the inequality of the distribution of resources in our society, right? Like the fact that I like to mention very quickly for people is that the poverty rate in the United States for children is 1 in 4. That 1 in 4 children live in a household that's below the poverty line. And that for elderly individuals, that rate is 1 in 10. Now, I'm not saying we should sacrifice grandma and grandpa so that kids have a better life, but we've obviously created a political system that, in my personal judgment, this is me personally speaking, but this is just my assessment of things. We've created a system that has more programs to eliminate poverty among the elderly than we have among children. Whether that's what we really want or not, I guess it's a different issue. Skeptics would say, well, children don't vote. Old people really vote a lot. So maybe that's why we have the system that we do. It's probably more complicated than that, but ecological economics, we'll talk about things like that, or we could talk about things like that if we had enough time. We could talk about issues of like, you know, um, transportation, how we fuel our transportation, whether it be by electric, by fossil fuels, whatever, right? And how much of an infrastructure do we create where people don't have to be dependent on cars? That's all part of ecological economics, which again is a bit more broad, a bit more transdisciplinary in how they look at things. So, in conclusion, here for this chapter, again, what we will see is that in our discussion of ecological economics, as each chapter ends, you're probably going to leave with more with more questions than you have definitive answers, unlike what you had as a feeling when you just took a standard economics course. Okay, so that's my just general introduction to why we study economics and why specifically we should study ecological economics.